The sound of that lock clicking wasn't just metal. It was betrayal made permanent. The memory of that night still burns in me, not just because of the cold air that seeped into my bones as I stood outside, but because of the way my heart shattered with every second that passed. That door was more than wood and hinges. It was the line between belonging and exile. And when they closed it against me, when the lock slid into place with that final metallic certainty, I realized I wasn't just shut out of a room. I was shut out of a life I thought was mine. I remember the sting of rejection crashing over me in waves. These were the people I trusted, the ones who were supposed to protect me, to shield me from the world when it got too cruel. Instead, they became the very architects of my humiliation. My knuckles were sore from knocking, my throat raw from calling their names, but no one came. Through the window, I could see the faint glow of warm light, laughter drifting from the living room, the silhouettes of those I once called mine moving casually as if I didn't exist, as if I wasn't standing in the dark, begging for entry. Rejection carries a weight that no one can see. It presses down on your chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to believe in yourself. In that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. I felt invisible, disposable, erased. It wasn't just about being locked out. It was about being deemed unworthy of belonging. That realization stripped me bare, and humiliation wrapped itself around me like chains I couldn't shake off. I could feel eyes on me even when no one was there. The thought that neighbors might peek through the curtains, watching me pound on the door only to be ignored, filled me with a shame so thick it nearly suffocated me. I pressed my forehead against the cold wood, tears burning at the edges of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Their laughter inside was the cruelest sound, a reminder that while I stood in darkness, they basked in warmth. My humiliation was their comfort. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, loneliness crept in like frost spreading across glass. The street was empty, the night air still, and the silence pressed in on me until it became unbearable. Loneliness ignored. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms, grounding me in the heat of my fury. I had been cast aside, but that did not mean I was powerless. Not anymore. Anger sharpened my senses, and suspicion soon followed. If they could betray me so easily, what else were they hiding? What lies were they covering with their laughter? What secrets were locked behind that door along with their warm smiles? I replayed every conversation, every glance, every half-truth I had ignored before. The more I thought, the more the pieces began to shift into patterns I hadn't noticed. This wasn't just rejection. This was strategy. This was calculated. The tension built inside me until I could hardly stand still. Every sound, the creak of the house settling, the murmur of voices drifting through walls, fed the storm building in my chest. I wanted to scream, to pound on the door until my fists bled, to make them face me. But another part of me whispered patience. Sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Sometimes standing still allows you to hear more than moving ever could. So I waited, trembling but listening, each second an eternity. And then came the shock. A voice from inside, clear and unguarded, carried through the thin air. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough. They weren't just locking me out, they were planning something bigger. Something that would have destroyed me entirely if I hadn't been there in the dark, listening. My heart pounded as realization sank in. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased, forgotten, crushed. And I knew then that this was more than betrayal. This was war. For a long time, shame had defined me. Shame for being poor, for being unwanted, for being the easy target of their cruelty. But that night, standing outside with the cold biting into my skin, shame began to shift. It didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to them. Because only cowards lock the door on someone who trusted them. Only the weak need walls and locks to protect their lies. That reversal washed through me, cleansing the humiliation they had poured over me. What rose in its place was not weakness, but triumph. They thought I was powerless, cast to just walk away from a locked door. I carried it with me. Each echo of that metallic click replayed in my mind like a cruel chorus, and no matter how much I tried to silence it, it burned deeper into me. Rejection is not a single act. It lingers, it spreads. It takes up residence in your body, your thoughts, your routines, until even the simplest tasks feel heavier than they once were. I felt it the next morning when I opened my eyes in my small apartment, the silence pressing down on me as though mocking the absence of anyone who cared. I felt it as I buttoned up my worn-out uniform for work, each frayed thread whispering a reminder of where I stood in the world. And I felt it most when I passed by strangers on the street, convinced their eyes could somehow see the scar of rejection branded across my chest. Humiliation layered itself on top of the rejection, wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe. When I caught my reflection in a shop window, I didn't just see myself. I saw what they had seen. Someone who didn't belong, someone easy to discard. Every laugh I overheard on the bus, every side glance in the diner became another cut, as if the whole world had joined in their cruelty. My rejection wasn't just private anymore. It felt public, as though everyone had been handed the script of my humiliation. Loneliness followed closely behind. Nights became the hardest, the hours stretching endlessly in silence. I would lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how I had become so disposable. It wasn't just about losing a place in their circle. It was about losing the sense of belonging altogether. Humans crave connection, and without it, the world becomes a cold, alien place. My bed felt too big, my apartment too empty, the city too loud and indifferent. And in those moments, the loneliness didn't just ache, it screamed. But with loneliness came anger, creeping in like embers glowing in the ashes of a fire. I tried to suppress it, telling myself anger would only destroy me. But anger has a way of demanding to be felt. It whispered in my ear during long bus rides. It burned in my chest when I saw their faces in passing, laughing as though nothing had happened. They had been preparing for it. The tension inside me grew unbearable, winding tighter with every day that passed. I felt like I was walking around with a storm in my chest, lightning ready to strike but nowhere to ground itself. Every interaction was charged. Every word they spoke to others laced with a duplicity only I could sense. I found myself avoiding them not out of fear, but because my composure was fragile, ready to snap. I knew one wrong look, one careless word, could ignite the fury I had been holding back. And yet, part of me craved that release, craved the moment when all the tension would finally spill over. Then came the shock, the moment when suspicion transformed into certainty. I overheard something I was never meant to hear. Passing by their gathering spot, hidden just out of sight, I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Words about money, about power, about silencing anyone who stood in the way. And then, my name. They weren't just trying to erase me emotionally. They were planning to erase me in ways I hadn't even considered. My knees went weak, my stomach twisted, but my mind sharpened with terrifying clarity. The shame I had carried for so long began to shift in that instant. For years, I had believed their cruelty was proof of my inadequacy, but now I saw it for what it truly was: cowardice. Their rejection wasn't about me being unworthy, it was about me being dangerous to their lies. I wasn't the weak one. They were. And that realization cracked open the chains of shame that had bound me for so long. The reversal was like stepping out of a shadow into blinding light. I was no longer the woman abandoned on the doorstep, begging for acceptance. I was the woman who had seen through them, who knew their secrets, who carried truths sharp enough to cut through their illusions. My rejection had become my weapon, their betrayal my fuel. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their acceptance to define me. I had something far stronger: resilience, clarity, and a truth they couldn't silence forever. And that gave me triumph, not the kind that shouts from rooftops, but the kind that simmers quietly in your veins, steady and unshakable. I began to walk taller. My shoulders no longer bowed under the weight of their rejection. I stopped hiding my eyes when I passed them, flourished louder, brighter, more exaggerated, as though my absence had become the stage for their performance. They wanted me to see it, to feel it, to believe that I was nothing but dead weight holding them back. I watched them strut through town as if they owned it, their laughter trailing behind like a parade of superiority. Every glance they gave me was calculated, every smirk a reminder of the door slammed in my face. They wanted me to know I was an outsider, to feel the sting of rejection with every step they took. Their arrogance wasn't just casual, it was flaunted. They dressed sharper, spoke louder, and carried themselves with an inflated pride that made every moment a show. Humiliation was their weapon, and they wielded it with precision. They didn't just exclude me, they made sure the world knew it. At gatherings, their whispers were designed to carry, their jokes aimed like arrows. When I passed by, their conversations would stop for just a moment, long enough for their eyes to rake over me, long enough for me to feel the weight of their mockery without a single word being said. It was the kind of cruelty that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was felt, heavy and cutting. The loneliness that followed was sharper than ever. Watching them together, watching the way they filled their lives with each other, made me feel like I was peering through glass at a feast I wasn't allowed to touch. They celebrated, they toasted, they lived loudly, while I sat in silence, swallowing the ache of being erased. Nights became endless again, the quiet of my small apartment screaming with the absence of belonging. And every smile they flaunted only deepened the hollow inside me. But with loneliness came anger, burning hotter than it had before. They didn't just move on without me, they wanted me to see it. They wanted me to suffer in silence, to believe that without them, I was nothing. That arrogance fanned the flames inside me until they roared. I told myself over and over, they could celebrate as much as they wanted, but their joy was built on sand. I refused to believe that their laughter was unshakable. Suspicion began to creep into my thoughts like ivy climbing a wall. People who live that loudly, who flaunt perfection so relentlessly, usually do so to hide something, invisible yet hyper-aware. Every fiber of me straining to catch the cracks in their act. And each time I caught even the faintest flicker of discomfort in their eyes, I felt the storm in me steady. I was right. Their world wasn't as whole as they wanted me to believe. Then came the shock, the moment that confirmed my suspicions. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, a slip of the mask I had waited for. During one of their smug gatherings, as they raised their glasses high and toasted to unshakable bonds, I saw one of them glance sideways, their smile faltering for just a heartbeat. Their eyes darted to another across the table, filled with something sharp, something unspoken, something real. In that moment, I realized their laughter wasn't unity. It was a cover. Their world wasn't perfect. It was fractured, stitched together with performance, and I had just caught the thread beginning to unravel. For so long, I had carried shame like it was mine to bear, believing their rejection defined my worth. But in that moment, watching their cracks show beneath their polished smiles, I realized the shame wasn't mine. It was theirs. Their need to perform perfection, their desperation to flaunt superiority was proof that they were hiding from themselves. My shame reversed itself, slipping from my shoulders like a weight I no longer needed to carry. And in its place came triumph. Not the kind they could see, not yet, but the quiet kind, the kind that grows in silence, steady and unstoppable. I no longer envied their lives, no longer ached for their acceptance. I saw them for what they were, fragile, desperate, terrified of being exposed. They thought they had silenced me, but they had only sharpened me. I wasn't broken. I was watching. I was waiting. I watched their smiles closely, and I knew some of them were fake. Secrets slip through cracks like light through keyholes, and I was watching. I had grown accustomed to being on the outside, to living on the edges of their world like an unwanted shadow. At first, it had been agony, the rejection gnawing at me until I felt hollow, faltered when a particular name was mentioned. A toast that rang hollow, even as the glasses clinked with practiced ease. They were good at pretending, but I was better at watching. And the more I observed, the more I realized there was something beneath the surface of their shining facade. Humiliation, which once kept me small, now became my fuel. Every time I remembered the sound of the lock clicking behind me, every time I replayed the way they looked at me as if I were nothing, I felt the sting all over again. But instead of drowning in it, I leaned into it. Humiliation sharpened my resolve, kept my eyes wide open. If they thought locking me out meant I would vanish, they underestimated me. The loneliness that once crushed me now became my ally. Alone, I could slip into places unnoticed, linger in shadows without question. No one was waiting for me at home. No one cared where I was or what I was doing, and that gave me freedom. While they performed for their audience, I became the silent witness. And in my loneliness, I began to piece together what others missed. Anger pulsed inside me, steady and unrelenting. It wasn't the reckless fire that consumed, it was the steady flame that illuminated. I told myself that every cruel laugh, every smirk, every reminder of my rejection was fuel. They believed they had stripped me of power, but my anger gave me clarity. It told me to keep watching, to keep listening, because sooner or later their arrogance would betray them. Suspicion became my constant companion. I began to map their patterns in my mind, connecting dots others didn't even see existed. Why did one of them always excuse themselves early from gatherings? Why did another suddenly avoid eye contact when certain topics arose? Why did their conversations, which once flowed freely, now feel forced, heavy with something unspoken? I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had lived in lies long enough to recognize the tremor in a voice, the dart of an eye, the weight of silence. The tension grew thicker with each encounter. Rooms that once rang with confident laughter now seemed fragile, every smile stretched thin like glass ready to shatter. I could feel it in the air, humming just beneath the surface. They were hiding something big enough. Abruptly, their eyes wide as they realized what they'd said aloud. The table went still, only for a second, before the performance resumed. But I caught it, that tiny crack, that glimpse of truth slipping through the keyhole. Shame, which had once belonged to me, suddenly shifted. I realized then that it wasn't me who should have been ashamed all along. It was them. Their need for perfection, their desperate grasp on appearances, their whispered slip of fear. It all revealed the truth I had long suspected. Their world wasn't perfect. It wasn't even stable. It was crumbling beneath the weight of their secrets. And in that realization, my shame reversed itself completely. I no longer saw myself as the discarded one, the unwanted one, the failure left behind. I was the observer, the witness, the one holding a piece of truth they didn't know had slipped into the open. My rejection hadn't broken me. It had positioned me exactly where I needed to be to see what others couldn't. That reversal gave me a quiet triumph, one they couldn't see but I carried in my chest like armor. They thought I was powerless, but I knew better now. Their secret, whatever it was, had already begun to leak, and I was there, watching, ready to catch every drop. And then, through the smallest slip, I caught sight of the truth. The things they hid weren't small. They were destructive enough to burn their whole world down. For weeks I had been catching fragments, glances, whispers, slips of the tongue that didn't match the polished stories they told the world. But suspicion, as heavy as it feels, is nothing compared to proof. Proof is a fire. Proof doesn't just flicker. It burns through denial, through arrogance, through every wall someone tries to build around their secrets. And the night I stumbled upon my first undeniable piece of evidence, I felt that fire ignite in my hands. It began like any other night. I was working one of my late shifts, invisible in the background as they lived their glittering lives. I had learned to move quietly, to listen without being noticed, to slip into spaces where they never expected me to be. That night, I was clearing away empty glasses from a side room during one of their endless parties, when I saw it. Light. In that moment, humiliation resurfaced. I thought of every time they had mocked me, every time they had locked me out, every time their laughter cut through me like a blade. They believed I was beneath them, insignificant, powerless. And yet here I was, holding evidence strong enough to topple the very empire they flaunted. The contrast between their cruelty and what I now carried was almost poetic. They had laughed at me for my poverty, for my exclusion, for my supposed weakness. But I was the one holding the truth that could unravel them completely. Loneliness had once made me feel small, like I was fading into the background of their world. But now, that same loneliness made me dangerous, because I had no one to betray, no ties that could be used against me. I could carry this knowledge without fear of it being stolen or silenced. I was alone, yes, but for the first time, I realized that meant I was free. Anger surged through me as I pieced together the implications of what I had found. This wasn't just about arrogance or cruelty anymore. This was about corruption, about lies woven so tightly into their lives that their very existence depended on keeping them hidden. And all the while they had mocked me for struggling, for surviving on scraps, while they feasted on stolen spoils. The injustice was unbearable, but it was also fuel. Suspicion sharpened into certainty. Every falter in their smiles, every nervous glance, every abrupt change of topic, it all made sense now. They weren't just hiding personal flaws. They were hiding something that could destroy them. Something that explained their desperation to silence me, to erase me, to make me feel invisible. They couldn't afford to let someone like me get too close, because invisibility, they forgot, allows someone to see what no one else does. The tension inside me was electric. Carrying the knowledge of their cruelty was one thing. Carrying evidence of their corruption was another entirely. Every step I took after that night felt heavier, as though the folder still weighed in my hands even when I had long since placed it back exactly as I'd found it. They didn't know I had seen it. They didn't know their secret had slipped. That the crack in their wall, I stared at the evidence, the shame lifted, crumbling like ash. It wasn't me who was pitiful. It wasn't me who was less, it was them. They had mocked me to cover their own fragility, their own fear, their own rot hiding behind golden doors. My shame reversed itself entirely, transforming into something sharp and unshakable. And in its place, triumph bloomed quietly. They had locked me out, but they hadn't locked their secrets tightly enough. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, forgotten that the woman they pushed aside still had eyes, ears, and resilience. I didn't just hold fragments anymore. I held the beginning of their undoing. I held the weapon they thought no one could find. The irony was almost too perfect. They believed locking me out would protect them. They believed rejection was power. But the truth was, their cruelty had placed me exactly where I needed to be, on the outside, watching, waiting, ready to catch what they dropped. And what they dropped wasn't small. It was dynamite. I left that night with my heart pounding, my steps unsteady, but my resolve ironclad. They didn't know what I had seen. They didn't know that in their arrogance they had handed me the very thing they feared most. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was dangerous. I didn't just hold the truth. I held the key to their destruction. The hardest secrets to keep are the ones that could set you free. After that night, after I laid eyes on what they thought would never be discovered, the world around me shifted. I still walked the same streets, still wore the same thrift store clothes, still counted every coin before paying for my groceries. But inside me, something monumental had. I wasn't just a woman locked out anymore. I was a woman carrying a truth so heavy, so volatile, that it hummed inside me like a live wire pressed against skin. It felt like a burden, one I hadn't asked for, one I couldn't put down. Every morning when I woke, the thought came before breakfast, before breath. You could destroy them today. And every night, as I lay on my worn mattress staring at the ceiling, it was there again, whispering, "You could end this charade now." But I didn't, because carrying a weapon is different from using it. And as intoxicating as the thought of justice was, the weight of that possibility sat on my chest like a stone. And yet, just beneath the fear, anger smoldered. Anger at their cruelty. Anger at every time they laughed while I cried in silence. Anger at how they locked me out. How they turned rejection into a spectacle. Anger at how they believed they were untouchable while they built their empire on lies. That anger wanted to roar, to scream the truth into their smug faces, to watch their arrogance crumble in real time. It was a tug of war inside me, fear pulling one way, fury pulling the other. But what made the battle unbearable was loneliness. I had no one to confide in, no friend to whisper the secret to, no shoulder to share the weight with. The betrayal had left me outside their circle, but it also left me outside everyone's circle. Secrets are heavy, but secrets in solitude are crushing. I walked around with the knowledge like a second skin, invisible to everyone else but suffocating me. I smiled when people spoke to me, nodded when they asked how I was, but inside, I was vibrating with the need to release what I knew. And then came the twist, the moment when my burden grew heavier, darker, sharper. Because what I discovered next wasn't just about them hiding corruption from the world. It was about them betraying each other. I saw it one evening when I was passing through a place I wasn't supposed to be, unseen as always. One of them, someone who had stood proudly at the center of their circle, someone who had locked me out without hesitation, was whispering furiously to another, accusing them of disloyalty. At first I thought it was nothing, just bickering, the kind of tension that flares and fizzles out. But then I caught the words, sharp and cutting. If anyone finds out, it won't just ruin you, it will ruin all of us. The air in my lungs froze. They weren't just united in lies. They were divided by them too. They didn't trust one another. Their smiles were masks not just for the world, but for each other. The betrayal ran deep, tangled in ways even they couldn't fully control. That discovery shifted everything. My fear dimmed, my loneliness sharpened into observation. Because now I understood. They weren't an unbreakable wall. They were cracks.
Shrink. Because while they mocked, I carried the truth, the kind of truth that could reduce their empire to ashes. The irony was almost unbearable. They believed locking me out had made me powerless, but it had done the opposite. It had given me eyes from the outside, ears they didn't notice, silence they mistook for weakness. I wasn't powerless. I was patient. The shock came not from their cruelty. It had long ago lost its sting. But from my own realization. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The shame I had carried for years, the shame they fed with their mockery, had dissolved. What replaced it wasn't just defiance, it was triumph. Quiet, hidden triumph. The kind that made me stand taller even when no one noticed. The kind that made me smile secretly when they sneered at me. The kind that whispered, "You already hold the key. They just don't know it." And in that triumph, I found clarity. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to burn myself trying to burn them. All I needed to do was wait. Because their empire wasn't stable. It was already rotting from the inside. And when the time came, I wouldn't just tell the truth. I would unleash it in a way they could never escape. For now, I carried it in silence. My silent burden. My weapon disguised as weight. My secret disguised as suffering. And every time they mocked me, every time they laughed, I held on to the knowledge like a blade hidden under my sleeve. They mocked me again, blind to the fact that I could already end them. Destruction doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it begins with a whisper. It started small, almost too small for anyone else to notice. A sharp look exchanged across a dinner table. A hand that lingered a little too long on a glass of wine, shaking ever so slightly. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. These moments would have slipped past anyone who wasn't paying attention. But I wasn't just paying attention. I was studying them like my survival depended on it. Because in some ways it did. The rejection had pushed me out of their circle. But that same rejection had gifted me with a perspective none of them could have. From the outside, I saw what they couldn't admit. They were splintering. Their unity, the air in
Others' eyes, guilt heavy in their expression. I saw how conversations that once flowed with arrogance now stumbled with suspicion. I saw how every shared smile seemed rehearsed, strained, hollow. Loneliness had once made me weak, but now it made me invisible. And invisibility gave me power. I slipped through places they didn't notice, stood in corners they didn't bother to glance at, and I became their unwilling witness. Every word they said, every half-truth they told, every mask they put on, I recorded it silently. Not on paper, but in memory, storing it for the day it would matter most. The anger inside me burned hotter with each discovery. How dare they lock me out while they lived in hypocrisy? How dare they mock my poverty while their own lives were stitched together with lies? Their cruelty no longer stung, it ignited me. And with every passing day, I became more certain that I would not only survive their betrayal, I would outlast them. Suspicion was no longer a whisper in my mind, it was a roar. I knew there was more, always more. Secrets don't come in singles. They multiply, they intertwine, until one lie becomes a web too heavy to hold. And their web was tightening. I watched them tug at it, pulling harder, each one afraid of being the one to break it. And in that fear, I saw weakness. The tension between them grew like storm clouds. They smiled in public, held hands, laughed at each other's jokes, but I could see the strain. The glances too sharp, the silences too long, the words too careful. They were no longer speaking freely. They were calculating, afraid that the wrong sentence would give too much away. And then came the shock. The moment I knew their crumble had already begun. I overheard a conversation, sharp and cutting, not meant for my ears. They thought they were alone, thought no one would hear, but I was there, invisible as always. One voice hissed, "If this comes out, it won't just be me who falls, it'll take all of us down." The weight of that sentence hit me like thunder. They weren't just hiding a secret, they were bound together by it, trapped in their own web of betrayal. If one fell, they all would. And I realized then that I didn't need to fight them. Didn't need because I knew the truth. I didn't need to break them. They were already breaking. Triumph doesn't always come with cheers or applause. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've survived long enough to watch those who tried to bury you start to dig their own graves. That was the victory I carried in my chest. And so, I remained silent, my eyes sharp, my ears open, my heart steady. I didn't rush. I didn't push. I didn't reveal what I knew. I let them unravel, thread by thread, lie by lie, betrayal by betrayal. And with every passing day, their world bent closer to breaking. Their lives weren't built on truth, but on lies stacked like cards ready to fall. The more I watched, the more I realized their entire existence was a performance. Their smiles, their handshakes, their perfect little speeches about loyalty and family, it was all a facade, carefully rehearsed, delivered with precision, as if they believed repeating the lies often enough would make them real. But lies don't hold forever. They may glitter for a time, but beneath the surface they rot. And I was there to see the rot spread. For so long they had painted me as the outcast, the one not worthy of belonging. But as I stood in the shadows, quietly observing, I saw the truth none of them dared to admit. They weren't a family bound by trust. They weren't friends tied by loyalty. They were conspirators, each one holding secrets that could destroy the other. They lived not with honesty,
but with constant suspicion. Their so-called unity stitched together with fear. The rejection had once made me feel small. It had crushed me, humiliated me, convinced me that maybe I wasn't enough. But now, as I watched the truth unfold, I realized that being locked out was the greatest gift they had ever given me. Because outside their walls, I could see everything. I could see the late-night whispers that didn't match their daytime smiles. I could see the papers tucked away in drawers, signed with names they never spoke aloud. I could see the betrayals, quiet but sharp, hidden behind champagne glasses and
of what they had done to me, but because of their sheer hypocrisy. They had cast me out, claimed I was beneath them, while their own lives were filthy with corruption. They had shut me out of their homes, while those homes were built on betrayal. They mocked me for the crumbs I survived on, but their feasts were stolen, and the injustice of it made my blood boil. Suspicion had become my compass, guiding me through the cracks in their world. I began to piece things together, dates that didn't line up, stories that contradicted, smiles that flickered when certain names were mentioned. Every small inconsistency was a thread, and I pulled them one by one until the whole fabric of their lies began to unravel before me. The tension of carrying what I knew was unbearable. Every time they laughed at me, every time they tried to push me down, I bit my tongue to keep from blurting the truth, because I couldn't expose it yet, not without proof. If I spoke too soon, they would destroy me, bury me under the weight of their wealth and power. I needed evidence, undeniable, irrefutable, sharp enough to pierce through their arrogance. And so I began to gather it, quietly, carefully. I memorized conversations, noted the times and places of their secret meetings. I found receipts that didn't match their stories, letters they thought no one had read, whispers of deals that would ruin them if brought to light. Each piece was a card I tucked into my own hand, building a deck strong enough to bring their house down when the moment came. The shock wasn't in discovering a single secret. It was in realizing how many there were. They weren't living double lives. They were living triple, quadruple lives, each mask layered on top of another. And every mask carried a crack. Their world wasn't just fragile. It was already crumbling, and they were too busy mocking me to see it. Shame, which had once been mine, began to shift onto them in my mind. They thought I should feel ashamed of my poverty, my exclusion, my survival. But what shame could compare to theirs? Shame for stealing, for betraying, for lying to the very people they pretended to love. My shame began to reverse itself. I was no longer the one hiding in shadows. They were, and the shadows were closing in. That realization gave me triumph, quiet but powerful. I no longer flinched when they pointed fingers. I no longer shadows as they met in a place they thought no one would notice. My breath was shallow, my pulse racing, as I crouched low, straining to hear their words through the thin walls. I scribbled quickly, each note a weapon for the future. But then, the door creaked. Footsteps. Too close. A shadow stretched across the floor toward me, and I realized with a jolt of fear that I had lingered too long. My hands froze, my chest tightened, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I thought it was over. And the night I almost got caught, I realized how dangerous my knowledge had become. Cruelty sharpens right before it snaps. The night I almost got caught while gathering their secrets left me shaken to the bone. My pulse had not calmed for hours. My hands trembled long after I was alone, and I couldn't stop replaying the moment I thought a shadow had found me. But fear didn't keep me down. It hardened into resolve. If anything, that brush with danger confirmed the truth. What I carried was powerful enough to destroy them, and that made me both valuable and vulnerable. Yet while I tiptoed through their lies with care, they continued their performance, more arrogant than ever. Their cruelty didn't slow, it sharpened. Perhaps they sensed whispers beginning to rise against them. Perhaps they felt cracks under their feet. But instead of softening, they lashed out harder. I was still their favorite target, the one they believed powerless, the one they could humiliate without consequence. It happened at one of their glittering events, a banquet that looked more like a coronation than a gathering. Chandeliers glittered overhead, champagne flowed like water,
and their laughter filled the hall with a sound that made every servant shrink a little smaller. I had been working, as always, invisible in my black uniform, carrying trays of glasses and plates. And then, as though my mere presence offended them, they pulled me into their spotlight once more. One of them, the loudest of the group, raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Look who they let in tonight," he sneered, his tone mocking. "Careful, everyone! Don't set your bags down! You might not see them again." Laughter followed, rolling like thunder through the room, sharp and cruel. Heads turned toward me, eyes gleaming with amusement at my halls filled with people eager to laugh along. Humiliation poured over me in waves. I lowered my eyes, clutching the tray tighter, willing myself not to cry, not to let them see me crumble, because that's what they wanted, not just to mock me, but to break me in front of witnesses. Loneliness pressed down heavier than ever. In a room filled with hundreds of people, I had never felt so alone. No one defended me. No one told them to stop. Even those whose smiles faltered, even those who clearly felt a flicker of discomfort, stayed silent. Silence was safer than siding with me, the outcast. And so I stood alone, drowning in their laughter, my heart splintering with each cruel word. But loneliness doesn't always weaken. It sometimes sharpens. In that suffocating moment when every eye was on me, my anger rose, hot and fierce. Anger at their arrogance, anger at their hypocrisy, anger at the injustice of being mocked by people who lived lies dirtier than anything they accused me of. They thought I was powerless. They thought rejection had locked me out for good. But what they didn't know was that rejection had placed me in the shadows where I could see everything. My suspicion deepened as I listened carefully that night, even through their laughter. Because arrogance makes people sloppy. When they boast, they reveal cracks they usually hide. And in their cruel performance, one of them slipped. Between taunts, between gulps of champagne, he bragged loudly. "We are untouchable. People like her could scream all day and no one would believe them. We built this city. We own its secrets." The words landed like a lightning strike. They weren't just mocking me. They were confessing, cloaked in arrogance. Untouchable. Secrets. Those words carried weight more than they realized. In their effort to humiliate me, they had revealed the very thread I needed to tug harder. Because no one is untouchable, and secrets always rot their way to the surface. The tension inside me snapped tighter, like a bowstring drawn too far. They thought their cruelty kept me in place, pinned beneath their feet. But with every laugh, every insult, every arrogant boast, they fed the fire inside me. My hands no longer trembled with fear. They steadied with purpose. They revealed themselves. It wasn't my poverty, my exclusion, my survival that was laughable. It was their desperate need to mock me, to cover their own rotting truths with arrogance. My shame reversed itself, wrapping around them like chains. In that reversal came triumph, quiet but unshakable. I no longer saw myself as powerless. I was the one holding the key, the one with the truth sharp enough to cut through their empire of lies. Their cruelty, meant to silence me, had only reminded me of my strength. And as I stood there in the glittering hall, laughter crashing down on me like waves, I whispered silently to myself, a promise I knew would one day come true. That day, I whispered to myself, the lock was turning against them. There's always a silence before destruction, and I was about to break it. After that night in the banquet hall, when their laughter cut me open for the last time, something inside me shifted permanently. Their cruelty no longer pierced me the way it once had. It no longer branded me as less or trapped me in shame. Instead, it hardened me, like fire hardens steel. I had endured enough rejection, enough humiliation, enough lonely nights convincing myself I was nothing. Now, standing in the wreckage of what they thought was my spirit, I realized I was stronger than they ever imagined. And strength, I knew, was nothing if I didn't use it. For so long, I had carried their secrets like a silent burden, torn between revealing them or staying safe in the shadows. Fear had whispered warnings. Insecurity had told me I would never win against them. But now, anger burned too hot to ignore.
Their arrogance, their boast of being untouchable, replayed in my mind over and over. No one is untouchable. Everyone has a lock that can be broken, and I was holding the key. I began preparing, not with reckless haste, but with patience. Destruction isn't a storm that comes unannounced. It brews slowly, in silence, until the clouds are too heavy to hold back. I became the silence. I walked through my days unnoticed, still serving, still working, still surviving, while quietly piecing together the truth they never wanted exposed. Each night, I laid out what I had already gathered. Scraps of receipts that didn't match their stories. Photographs captured in moments they thought no one was watching. Notes of whispered conversations overheard when they believed became my ally. While they mocked me in public, while their circle toasted their so-called perfection, I was in the shadows, watching, recording, document. My days blurred into long shifts and longer nights. I slept little, ate little, lived only for the plan that was taking shape inside me. Every sacrifice was worth it, because every step brought me closer to justice. The tension grew unbearable at times. I moved like a shadow through their world, careful not to leave traces. Every time I followed one of them down a quiet street, every time I slipped a phone from a table long enough to photograph its contents, every time I eavesdropped just out of sight, my heart pounded so loud I feared it would give me away. But fear no longer froze me. It fueled me, because the closer I came to exposing them, the clearer it became. They weren't just cruel. They were dangerous. And then came the shock. Discoveries that went deeper than I imagined. Betrayals not just against me, but against each other. Secrets of stolen money. Of affairs hidden behind polished smiles. Of backstabbing inside their own circle. They weren't united by loyalty. They were bound together by fear and lies. Their power wasn't built on strength. It was built on a fragile web, and I now held the scissors to cut it apart. I could have struck then, exposed them with what I had, but humiliation had taught me patience. Rejection had taught me resilience. Loneliness had taught me silence. I waited. I sharpened my evidence until it was undeniable, until not even the cleverest of them could twist it. Proof layered upon proof, until their lies became a tower too heavy to stand. As my plan solidified, shame reversed itself inside me once. I was no longer the outcast, no longer the invisible girl mocked in banquet halls. I was the one with power, the one with the truth. They thought they had locked me out forever, but in their arrogance, they had forgotten one thing. The person you ignore sees everything, and I had seen enough to destroy them. For the first time in years, I felt
been the one on the outside of the locked door, listening to their laughter, enduring their cruelty, swallowing their rejection like poison. And now, for the first time, I had whispered into their world, not with tears, not with pleas, but with a fragment of truth sharp enough to pierce their arrogance. I didn't unleash everything at once. No storm begins with thunder. It starts with a shift in the wind, a single drop of rain. That was my strategy. My first strike wasn't about destruction. It was about destabilization, about showing them that their fortress wasn't impenetrable, that the walls they had built so high around themselves already had cracks forming. I chose my moment carefully, not in front of a crowd, not where they could mask their fear with laughter. I wanted privacy, because fear grows best in silence when there's no audience to perform for. I sent the evidence, not the whole pile, just one piece, undeniable but incomplete. A photograph, a receipt, a detail so precise it couldn't be dismissed as rumor, yet vague enough to leave them wondering how much more I knew. When the first of them saw it, their face shifted almost imperceptibly. I watched from the corner of the room, invisible as always, as their smile faltered for just a heartbeat. But then, just as quickly, the mask snapped back into place. They laughed, waved it off, muttered something about bitter people inventing stories. I knew who they meant. They meant me, the poor, rejected girl on the outside. the one they had always underestimated. Their dismissal should have stung. In the past, it would have. Rejection had once carved into me like a knife, each humiliation leaving scars I thought would never heal. But now, their arrogance only confirmed what I already knew. The first strike had landed. They were afraid to admit it, even to themselves. But I saw it. The flicker of doubt, the way their hand trembled as they folded the paper, the way their eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. Loneliness still clung to me in those moments. Even as I carried the truth, even as I set the storm in motion, I was still alone. No allies, no one to share the burden of what I knew. The weight of it pressed heavy on my chest, and there were nights when the silence of my small room echoed danger.
My suspicion had grown sharper with every secret I uncovered. They weren't just arrogant, they were ruthless. If they discovered how much I truly knew, they wouldn't hesitate to turn their power against me. That was why the first strike had to be subtle, a whisper, not a shout. Enough to unsettle them, but not enough to reveal the full extent of my hand. The tension between us grew almost immediately. I saw it in the way they looked at each other, sidelong glances, forced laughter, conversations that stopped when I walked by. For years, I had been invisible. Now, for the first time, I felt their eyes on me. Not with pity, not with mockery, but with suspicion. They didn't know what I had or how much I had seen, but they knew I was no longer powerless. And then came the shock. One of them confronted me. Not directly, not publicly, but in a quiet corner after an event. Their voice was sharp, their smile tight, but beneath it I heard the tremor of fear. "You think you know something," they said, "but you don't. Don't involve yourself in matters that are beyond you. It won't end well." It was meant to intimidate me. Once upon a time it would have worked. I would have lowered my head, apologized for stepping out of place, begged for forgiveness. But not anymore. This time I looked them in the eye and said nothing. Silence was my weapon now, and I watched as they shifted uncomfortably under it, because silence, more than words, makes people afraid. Walking away from that encounter, I felt the shame that had once chained me begin to reverse itself entirely. Their warning wasn't proof of their power, it was proof of their fear. They wouldn't have bothered with me if they truly believed I was powerless. They wouldn't have confronted me if they didn't already feel the walls of their world beginning to shake. For the first time, I felt triumph. Not complete, not overwhelming, but the first taste of it. It was quiet, steady, like the hum of a storm gathering far off. They still believed they could laugh me off, dismiss me as bitter, accuse me of jealousy. But I had seen the first crack. I had seen it in their eyes, in the way their voices wavered when they thought no one was listening. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the collapse had already begun. But when the first crack appeared, I knew the collapse had begun. Pride breaks fastest when faith about speed, it's about precision. Every night, I sifted through the pieces I had collected, the receipts, the photographs, the overheard conversations, the inconsistencies in their stories. Each fragment was small on its own, but together they formed a picture too clear to ignore. And as I pieced it together, I realized something even more shocking. The betrayal didn't come from outside. It came from within their own circle, from people they trusted most. That twist hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had been on the outside, watching them mock me, exclude me, humiliate me. I thought their cruelty made them untouchable, united in their superiority. But the truth was uglier. They weren't united, they were fractured. Their smiles were masks, their laughter a cover for the mistrust already festering beneath. And the evidence I carried was more than proof of hypocrisy. It was a mirror they couldn't look away from. The humiliation I had endured still lingered like smoke in my lungs. I remembered standing outside in the cold, locked out of their warmth, hearing their laughter through closed doors. I remembered the sting of rejection, the whispers of pity, the sharpness of their words. Those memories could have broken me, but now they fueled me. Each scar was a reminder of why I couldn't stop, why I wouldn't stop until their pride shattered the way they had tried to shatter mine. The loneliness of carrying their secrets weighed heavily. I had no allies, no one to lean on. Every step I took toward revealing the truth was a step alone. At night, the silence of my room felt suffocating, pressing in on me with the weight of what I knew. I questioned myself over and over. What if they turned it against me? What if I became the villain in their story, the bitter outsider desperate to destroy them? But each time the doubt rose, anger silenced it, because what I carried wasn't lies. It was truth, and truth, no matter how they twisted it, had a power they couldn't erase. Suspicion gnawed at me as I watched them. They still carried themselves with arrogance, still laughed loudly in public, still flaunted their wealth and their superiority, but their eyes gave them away. I saw the way they looked at each other when they
Came, I didn't shout. I didn't demand their attention. I simply laid it out. Evidence. Clear and undeniable. A photograph passed across the table. A document left where the right eyes could find it. A message forwarded to a phone that buzzed in the silence of their laughter. Piece by piece, the truth unraveled in front of them, stripping away their arrogance like silk torn from skin. At first, they tried to laugh. That was their instinct. Mockery, dismissal, cruelty. "This is nothing," one of them said, their voice trembling as they forced a smile. "Jealous lies. Pathetic." But the laughter didn't spread this time. It died in their throats as their eyes darted across the evidence, each piece connecting to the next in a web they couldn't escape. And then came the shock, the realization that the betrayal wasn't from outsiders, but from within. One of their own had turned. One of their own had built the lies, had betrayed their trust, had cracked the foundation of their empire. I saw it in their faces as they looked at each other, suspicion curdling into fury. The mask of unity shattered in an instant, replaced by accusations whispered like daggers across the table. For years I had been their target. Their cruelty had been aimed at me, their rejection my burden to carry. But in that moment I watched them turn on each other, their perfect circle splintering under the weight of truth. Their humiliation wasn't mine anymore, it was theirs. Shame, once my constant companion, reversed itself entirely. I wasn't the one crumbling under the gaze of others. I wasn't the one whose secrets had been dragged into the light. I was the one holding the light. And in that reversal, I felt triumph. Not loud, not vengeful, but quiet, steady, unshakable. Their pride, so sharp and untouchable, broke in front of me. Their voices rose in panic. Their hands trembled as they shuffled through the evidence, their perfect facades collapsing like glass under pressure. And through it all, I stood silent, watching, holding the knowledge they had tried so hard to keep from me. Because the greatest shock of all wasn't the evidence itself. It wasn't even the betrayal from within their circle. It was the realization that the person they had mocked, rejected, locked out, had been the one to
Forever. Not laughter, not pride, not cruelty disguised as superiority. And the day finally came when their laughter was replaced with something else entirely. Whispers. Whispers sharp as knives. Whispers that didn't wound me anymore, but cut into them instead. It didn't happen all at once. Empires never collapse in a single day. They crack, slowly at first, then all at once when the weight of their own lies becomes too heavy to bear. I watched those cracks spread like lightning through the storm clouds of their lives. At first, it was subtle. Invitations to their glittering gatherings grew fewer. People who once rushed to sit by their side now avoided their gaze. Their smiles were met with hesitation instead of admiration. The whispers followed them like shadows, impossible to outrun. The humiliation that once belonged to me now belonged to them. I remembered the sting of sitting in silence while they mocked me. Remembered the feeling of eyes turning toward me with judgment and pity. Now it was their turn. I saw it at a luncheon, where once they had dominated the room with their laughter. This time, the laughter was hollow, and the conversations quieted when they walked in. Their eyes flicked nervously from table to table, searching for the approval that had once come so easily. But approval is fickle, and it had already abandoned them. For years, loneliness had been my companion, a constant reminder that I had been cast out of their world. I had stood on the outside looking in, carrying the weight of their rejection like a stone on my back.
But as I watched them stumble through the ruins of their reputation, I no longer felt alone. In fact, I felt something I had never expected: belonging. Not because I had been invited back in, but because their circle itself was crumbling, leaving them as outsiders in the very world they once ruled. Anger had once fueled me, the fire that kept me alive when their cruelty threatened to suffocate me. That anger hadn't faded, it had simply transformed. I didn't want to see them destroyed just for revenge. I wanted them to feel what I had felt. I wanted them to understand humiliation, abandonment, the way it eats at your soul until you question your own worth. And now, finally, I saw that understanding dawning in their eyes. Their arrogance had been replaced with desperation, their superiority with fear. Suspicion spread among them like a plague. They had trusted each other once
To break. Voices were sharper, smiles tighter, laughter forced. They snapped at each other over the smallest things, suspicion lurking in every word. The circle that once locked me out was now locking each other out, piece by piece. The shock, when it came, wasn't in their collapse. It was in how quickly it accelerated. One scandal led to another, each secret feeding the next, until their world began to unravel faster than anyone expected. Financial lies came to light, relationships cracked under the weight of infidelity, and alliances turned to rivalries overnight. The very people who once strutted through life with untouchable arrogance were now scrambling to salvage what little dignity they had left. And the more they scrambled, the more the world whispered. I stood in the shadows, watching it all unfold, and for the first time, I felt no shame. The shame that had haunted me, that had wrapped itself around my heart like chains, had reversed completely. I wasn't the one being whispered about anymore. I wasn't the one carrying the weight of humiliation. It was them. And in that reversal, I found triumph. Not loud, not boastful, but steady, unshakable. Their downfall was poetic justice. Every insult they had thrown at me, every time they had turned me into a spectacle for their amusement, was now coming back to them. But worse, because while they had mocked me for being poor, for being powerless, their own downfall came not from poverty or weakness, but from betrayal within their own ranks. They weren't mocked for what they lacked. They were mocked for what they had lost. The very empire they had built on arrogance and cruelty. I saw it in their eyes. The desperation, the frantic attempts to claw back what was slipping through their fingers. They tried to laugh, but the sound was brittle. They tried to carry themselves with pride, but their shoulders sagged under the weight of shame. They had once believed themselves invincible, untouchable. Now they were fragile, exposed, the same way they had once left me. But justice is never simple. As satisfying as it was to see them crumble, I knew it wouldn't end quietly. Empires don't fall without resistance. People who thrive on cruelty don't surrender it easily. And as I watched them fracture, as I saw their empire collapse piece by piece, knives, cutting into my pride, my worth, my very existence. But what I didn't understand then, what I came to see with brutal clarity, was that cruelty of that kind doesn't stay pointed outward forever. Eventually it turns inward. Eventually, betrayal eats. The first signs were subtle. A glance too sharp across a table. A whispered conversation that stopped the moment another entered the room. Laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. At first I thought I was imagining it, that my desire for justice was painting cracks where there were none. But cracks once noticed have a way of widening under scrutiny. And I watched, patient and silent, as their unity splintered into factions. Their downfall wasn't just about exposure anymore. It wasn't about me standing on the outside, watching them collapse. It was about them tearing each other apart with the same precision they once used to humiliate others. Their alliances, once so carefully crafted, began to fracture. Friends turned into rivals. Confidants became enemies. And the deeper I looked, the more I saw the truth. Betrayal had been living in their circle all along, hidden under the glitter and pride. Humiliation, which had once been my constant companion, now clung to them. They accused one another of disloyalty, of betrayal, of weakness. Meetings that had once been filled with laughter and arrogance now turned into shouting matches behind closed doors. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't have to be.
The whispers carried far enough, and the aftermath was plain in their faces when they stepped back into the public eye. Strained smiles, tightened jaws, eyes that no longer trusted the people beside them. Loneliness, too, began to haunt them. I saw it in their eyes when the crowds grew thinner, when invitations stopped arriving, when the very people who once clung to them now avoided them like a disease. They had locked me out, left me standing in the cold, convinced I was powerless without their approval. Now it was they who were locked out, cast aside by the very society they had ruled, their exile made heavier by the knowledge that they had brought it on themselves. And oh, how the anger festered among them. I could feel it in the air whenever they gathered, the simmering resentment, the jealousy, the hunger to blame someone, anyone, for the ruins of their empire.
The tension was unbearable to watch, yet mesmerizing. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the rocks crumble beneath the feet of those who had once pushed me over. They no longer needed me to expose them. They were exposing themselves, piece by piece, through their own infighting. And each argument, each fracture, each whispered accusation brought them closer to the collapse they had once mocked me for predicting. Then came the shock. The moment that proved betrayal had eaten so deep it could no longer be hidden. One of them, someone they had trusted, someone they had leaned on during their rise, stepped forward with proof of their lies. Not to the world, but to their own circle. Documents, messages, evidence of corruption and deceit that implicated them all. It was a betrayal so deep, so personal, that even I, who had waited for this moment, felt the sting of it. I watched as their empire burned from within. Not in flames, but in the slow suffocation of trust dying. Their words turned venomous. Their smiles vanished entirely. Their unity collapsed like a house of cards caught in a storm. And in that collapse, I saw something I never expected. Shame. Not shame for what they had done to me. Not shame for the cruelty they had wielded so casually. But shame for being exposed. For being revealed as weak, as fallible, as broken. The shame reversal was complete. I no longer carried the humiliation of being locked out. They did. They carried it in every whisper, every suspicious glance, every accusation flung like a knife in the dark. The shame that had once crushed me now crushed them, and I stood taller than I ever had, no longer defined by their rejection, but by my resilience. Their triumphs, the ones they had flaunted so proudly, turned into rubble before my eyes. Friendships dissolved into rivalries. Alliances became battlegrounds. Their empire of pride, built on exclusion and cruelty, collapsed completely, not because of me, but because of their own betrayal. I had waited for this moment, hungered for it, dreamed of it. And yet when it came, it was quieter than I imagined. No explosions, no dramatic confessions, just the sound of arrogance imploding, the quiet collapse of people who had fed on cruelty, finally choking on it. And then,
Hadn't grasped until that very moment. I had already won. I didn't need their pleas, their apologies, or their recognition. Their collapse was the proof. Their humiliation was the justice. And my freedom, the freedom they thought they had stolen when they locked that door on me, was already mine. I walked away from them not with vengeance burning in my chest, but with something far greater: dignity. For years they had tried to convince me I was nothing without them, that their world was the center of everything, and without access to it, I would starve not only in body, but in soul. But standing in the ashes of their empire, I realized the truth. I had never needed them. They had needed me, to be the shadow they mocked, the mirror they used to see themselves as superior. And when I refused to play that role anymore, their foundation cracked. Rejection had once felt like the end of me. I remembered the sound of that lock clicking shut, the way it echoed like finality, like a death sentence. I had thought it was the sound of my worth vanishing, but now I knew better. It had been the beginning. Their rejection had pushed me into the shadows where I found the truth, where I learned to see clearly, where I discovered strength they would never possess. Their cruelty had carved scars into me, yes, but scars don't make you weaker. Scars make you unbreakable. Humiliation had been my constant companion once. I had worn it like a second skin. Every insult, every laugh, every mocking glance layered over me until I barely recognized myself. But humiliation doesn't last forever. It transforms. I carried it long enough for it to harden into resolve, into fire, into a determination that would not be extinguished. And now, watching them squirm in their own shame, I realized that humiliation had never truly belonged to me. It had always been theirs. They just hadn't lived long enough in silence to recognize it. Loneliness had once been the sharpest wound. I had stood in the cold, staring at a locked door, convinced I had been abandoned, convinced no one would ever see me, hear me, stand beside me. But loneliness, too, has a way of shifting shape. It forces you to hear your own voice with silence that echoed louder than their jeers. Suspicion had been my weapon. They thought locking me out made me blind, but it gave me the sharpest eyes. I had seen them in ways they never saw each other. I had caught the slips, the cracks, the betrayals they tried to hide. They underestimated me, ignored me, dismissed me as insignificant. And in that dismissal, they exposed themselves. My invisibility had been my greatest strength, the cloak that let me walk unnoticed as I gathered the truths that would one day bury them. Tension had haunted me every step of the way, a weight that threatened to crush me. The nights I carried their secrets in silence, the days I endured their cruelty with lips sealed. I had feared that silence would break me. But tension, like fire, doesn't only destroy, it tempers, it sharpens. And when the time came to speak, my voice was steady because it had been honed in silence. Their voices cracked because they had never known restraint. The shock of revelation had not been mine alone, it had been theirs. Watching their faces when the truth hit them, when the lies they had built their world on turned to ash, was the kind of justice no courtroom could deliver. They had believed themselves untouchable. But truth touches everything. And when it came for them, there was no shield, no laugh, no arrogance strong enough to protect them. The shame reversal was complete. For years, I had been the outsider, the one they mocked, the one they humiliated. But now it was they who bore the weight of whispers, they who carried the burden of ridicule, they who felt the sting of eyes watching and judging. The silence they once weaponized against me was now their prison. They no longer laughed at me. They no longer even looked at me as beneath them. They looked at me with the hollow eyes of the fallen, the desperate. And finally, triumph. Not the kind that comes with crowns or riches or applause. A quieter, deeper triumph. The triumph of survival. The triumph of dignity. The triumph of knowing I had been tested, broken, humiliated, and still risen. Stronger than they could ever imagine. They had tried to erase me with rejection, but rejection only wrote me into a story they could never escape. I didn't stay to watch their empire crumble completely. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough. Often, the night they locked me out, the sound of the door shutting like a blade, slicing through my worth. That sound had haunted me for so long, but now, when I heard it in my memory, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like freedom. That lock hadn't imprisoned me. It had released me. Released me from their world of lies, their empire of cruelty, their fragile illusion of superiority. They had silenced me once with a locked door. But now, it was their silence that stretched on endlessly. No more laughter, no more jeers, no more voices raised in arrogance. Just silence. And that silence was the sound of justice. Because in the end, the truth had spoken louder than all of them. They once silenced me with a locked door, but now it is their silence that will never end. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and share your favorite moment in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me, at what point would you have struck first? Drop your answer below. For more fearless, real-life inspired stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. And please share this video with anyone who has ever felt the sting of rejection. They might find their own key to strength.